I got a text last Friday from Larry Warren, who said my trip was bumped up a week. So that means my familiarity in advance for Nathaniel, which is the next chapter lined up, put that off. I may not even be teaching on that, but I had the book, and those of you who also have the book will be blessed by what has been culled for the delivery, and we encourage you to read another person's point of view, of course, for certain things. To fill a whole chapter, the author takes a lot of liberties to express his perception of certain events that I probably will not, and I will explain that as we go. But we are basing this quarter from the book, and that was Larry Warren's choice, and this is Larry Warren's class quarter. So I'm guest teaching. This isn't my book, this isn't my chapter, this really isn't even my work. Just titled a few things differently and culled a few lines for my style, but everything is his. And so I got a text from him Sunday afternoon saying that he completed the PowerPoint slides as he normally would, and he emailed them to me. And I thought, it's hard sometimes to get people who are accountable for things to do their full job, much less someone. It's rare and exceptionally worthy of notation and honor to see someone who does what he didn't have to do in order to make it a blessing for me, and that meant a lot. So I will honor his work and portray his slides with only maladaptations by me. And that way it's familiar to you, but my teaching style will be a little different. I'll summarize a lot. And like I always joke with Terry, if we get done earlier tonight, then that's fine. And she laughs at that, because when have we ever gotten done earlier? I don't remember that anyway. No idea. So tonight we're going to talk about this. As a Christian, it is encouraging to just be more familiar with the life that was around the incarnate Christ. We believe in Christ, so we want to learn more about what it was like when he was there. And yes, we're interested in what the people were like, who were around him. Who did he choose and why? We want to get to know these guys. And the author, like I mentioned, takes some liberties of his interpretation of certain temperaments that I will not stress, because I believe there were natural human tendencies that were in each of them that were positives. And the only disclaimer I will give is that I believe strengths can be weaknesses. And I think that's what we see in Philip tonight. The book's author, I think, tends to, and I've noticed this in his writings, he tends to accentuate the change of Christ's power, Christ's changing power in a character, in a person, in faith. And he accentuates that by the other opposite, maybe extreme. He might, I won't say harp on, he might emphasize, overly focus on some of the weaknesses of an individual, and maybe to a fault. That's my editorializing, but I didn't feel comfortable in reading the chapter itself, because I thought, I kind of like this guy, Philip, and I relate to him in a lot of ways. Maybe that's why. So I will emphasize that as we go and make it more personal. So my disclaimer is, yes, strengths can be seen as a person's weakness. So we're looking at Philip the bean counter, and I will we will be looking at Philip. And I like how he says in the past we've looked at the top 4 listed, and now we're into the second group of 4, and I'm going to be a little nice to this guy. Now, if you took this profile picture and went back in time, would you be able to spot him? It's always humorous to me when we may not know, if we have no credible work of antiquity that describes a human being, how it's portrayed. It's just good to put a face to a name for us to know these were real people. And that's what's so cool. Like, for example, though Paul is not obviously in this list, he was called afterwards, especially called by God later in a unique way. But we do have accounts of Paul and what he looked like, a veiled reference. He was short and bald. We do know that. But you think about that. But do we know about these others? Some details are just not mentioned. It's not important, I guess. James the Less, Shorty, that's another one, but Larry will get to that. Let's look at this for a moment. I want to have Philip in our minds. I think that if we were Philip, we would be appreciative that he created me, God chose me, and God matured me. And as he did with everyone else. And I think that we need to be humble enough to remind ourselves, if we went back in time and were these disciples, later apostles, if we were with these men, we would be just like they. we would have our own moments of showing strength and weakness, success and failure, and we would have our own points of growth. And we all still do that to this very day. So the human element needs to be remembered. These were just guys who, when Christ was with them, makes all the difference. And Christ is with us. A summary. Here's a summary of, let's see, how did I do this? Oh, yeah, I missed a few key beats there. The 4 biblical lists that give us the 12 apostles, the 5th name on every list is, boom, Philip. This is no coincidence, and the fact that it is listed this way helps us realize that within the second group of those who were clustered together, maybe closer knit, with their own distinct roles as a group, Philip is the leader, with very influential roles and, as we will see, assumed assignments. So we focus so much on Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and even in the inner circle, even there. But what about the second group, often mentioned together? Philip's kind of the forerunner, with his own distinct character. There is, provided for you on this screen, blocked off for a little easier notation. Still, I know too small to read, but I want to mention this for you so that you can know where this is coming from. This is the work from, it's just a summary. If I only had like 10 minutes, I would go straight to this book, All the Men and Women of the Bible by Herbert Lockyer. And it doesn't give any filler, no editorializing, just the facts. And this one sheet scan is just the facts of the name Philip, and in particular the one that we're talking about tonight. And this will be a good preview for us. I'll read what's blocked off on the screen. Unlike Andrew and John, Philip did not approach Jesus, but waited till he accosted him and invited him to join his company. Andrew and John found Jesus, quote unquote. Jesus found Philip, whose name is a Greek one by both custom and derivation. A Jewish name he must have had, since all the apostles were Jews, but what it was remains unknown. So we don't need to know it. And the fact that we don't is a very telling thing. The author here tonight will get to that. The conversion and call of Philip are expressed simply, Jesus findeth Philip, and saith unto him, follow me. That's kind of all we have to go on. So the call to faith and the call to follow came at once, and Philip was ready for both. That says a lot about Philip. The impressive feature of this conversion is that as soon as Christ found him, Philip sought to bring others to Christ. That is a great message on evangelism and what happens when you come to know Christ. You want to tell someone else about the blessing. The convert became a soul winner. Come and see, he said to Nathanael. And he won a friend to Christ. Lesson could be over right there. That's great, isn't it? Beautiful. But the lesson's not over. The Lord knew what he was doing when he sought him out. Now, in a way, in his pre-existent state and in his sovereign state, aided by the Spirit on earth, for sure, God knew what he was doing. He already selected these men. He knew what was going to take place. But they each would have their developmental moments. And this is the blocked off event that the author of tonight's book focuses a lot on and gives some of his personal opinions about. But let's focus on some facts. When the hungry multitude gathered around Christ at the Sea of Galilee, Philip was tested by Christ. This is John chapter 6, verse 5. You might want to just keep your Bibles open there. John chapter 6, verse 5. Philip was singled out for a test of his faith and for a great opportunity, which he lost. And with it lost a blessing. Instead of telling the master that he was able to feed the hungry crowd. And I'll mention in just a moment, that wasn't exactly the question, but that was there in the test. And failing to acknowledge this ability that Jesus would have to take care of the situation, Philip made a mental calculation of how much food would be necessary to give each person a portion, and how much it would cost, and declared the project to be impossible. The seeking Greeks were also led to Philip, but although he sympathized with their request to see Jesus, or the Christ, he was afraid and almost lost another opportunity. That's in John chapter 12. Yet Philip experienced familiar friendship with Jesus, for did he not call him by name? Slow to apprehend truth, he missed much, but Jesus had nothing but kind words for him. This is why I will say I cannot and will not, in this opportunity I have on this platform, be as harsh towards Philip as our author tonight in the book. I cannot do that and be true to my conscience. And I'll explain this as we go. Nonetheless, Jesus only had good things to say about him. Tradition tells us that Philip died a martyr at Hierapolis. That name may sound familiar to you, but that place, because we recently talked about Laodicea. And we have, thanks to Larry, a few pictures that I was looking for myself, and I couldn't find them as easily, but I'm glad he found them. I want to show you some things towards the end of the class that I think you'll appreciate. So Philip is a Greek name, and that's because Greek was the culture. That's just a fact. Greek was the culture. And the idea is very telling that who is Jesus for? Well, look at Philip. The very fact that Philip is with the Christ, or with this man Jesus, makes me wonder if I, as just even a Samaritan, because I might believe, I might be a grafted in God-fearer, but regardless of the pure line, I wonder who Jesus is for. Well, look at Philip. He was culturally a Hellenist. And that's very telling. I think it's a great, great story to, or a great fact to see who is around Jesus. So just take that for what it is. Don't confuse this Philip with the deacon. The Philip that we're studying is before Pentecost. He doesn't show up afterwards. The Philip who's the deacon, who's done a lot of things that we talked about, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, for example, that's after the day of Pentecost, and he's only seen from that point forward. So there are a lot of Philips. This is one. Otherwise, I'd be preaching on evangelism, and this would be the Debo talking about that. But we're not. We're not talking about that one. We're talking about this one, the apostle. The apostle Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Since they were all God-fearing Jews, Philip probably grew up attending the same synagogue as Peter and Andrew. So there's the same shared history and identity there. Because of the relationship that existed between them, the sons of Zebedee, Philip was possibly acquainted with all four. And for benefit of the recording, I'll go ahead and read these important details. There is a good bit of evidence, biblically speaking, internal biblical evidence that Philip, Nathanael, Thomas were all fishermen from the sea area of Galilee. Because in John 21, after the resurrection, when the apostles returned to Galilee and Peter said, I am going fishing, verse 3, the others who were there all answered, we are going with you also. And according to verse 2, that group included Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. The unnamed two others were most likely Philip and Andrew, because elsewhere they are seen in the company of the men who are named in that passage. That's just good deduction. People who study the scriptures in a way that I personally don't, but I appreciate their mind to bring that to our attention. And if he goes on to say, if all these seven were so familiar in their professional work in the same area, they were likely friends or close co-workers, and they shared, of course, the same heritage, same identity, same schooling. This shows how close-knit of a group that they were. And so it's very telling that Jesus would pick some people who already knew each other. Jesus located and called Philip, a native where Peter and Andrew also can say, I'm from. What do we know about Philip? What do we know about Philip? Basically, thanks to the gospel account of John, is pretty much all we know. He gives the only vignettes that we have. And he's a different type of person than Peter and Andrew and James, very different indeed. And even among his comrades, Philip stands unique. We have here, and I think I'm in screen, yes, we have here some positive attributes of the man. And I highlighted what we can know based on his skill sets that are seen in the tasks that are given. You can read the rest. I will not. But we do see some positive traits, such as, piecing together, it seems that Philip was a classic process person. He was a facts and figures type of guy. And yes, even by the book. I've often heard there are reasons for rules. Sometimes there are exceptions, and there are clauses for those exceptions. Practically minded. And this is where the author takes some liberties based on John chapter 6. You might agree with him. That's okay. I've already stated that I wouldn't go so far as to put my name to some of the terms that he uses to describe his failure in this case. But I believe that a person is more than sometimes the moments of their failure. Certainly there can be consequences, and certainly that can reveal character or lack of faith in some cases, what you're not focusing on sometimes. Like, I knew better than that, but what about in that moment? Was it a good thing to say or not? Well, a person is bigger than their moments of failure, and Philip certainly grew past his. He grew past his failures, and God's wisdom and power certainly revealed those in time. He also chose who he wanted. God knew what he was doing when he picked these people, and in addition to 1 Corinthians 1:27, I draw attention to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. And in your own mind, you can reference that. It's this idea that we are earthen vessels. We are all earthen vessels of this tremendous treasure of the gospel of Christ. We are not perfect. We are flawed. We know that we're following the perfect Lord, the perfect plan, the perfect will, who perfects us as we mature. That's what's perfecting us, and that's the process of it. But we're not there. But we know we're following the perfect plan, and that's very important. So as we skip back to what is in the book anyway, earlier in the chapter, I'll make reference now. Jesus was appointing these men to the formidable task of being apostles, spending time with them so that they would be developed to be proxies for him and develop this will to do what was necessary, to speak for the power of attorney, to speak on his behalf. And in the process for something so important, you might think that Jesus would sit down and through conventional ways today, scour the world to find the most qualified people. It wasn't necessarily about that, was it? You know, they had to meet maybe certain credentials, but in one way, the people he picked were qualified. Obviously, they had to fit certain templates in order to follow him willingly. But in many more ways, Jesus was the one who had to qualify them. And I think that's an emphasis that we need to see. I have a note here that says, read screen. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay. Jesus would draw them to himself, train him, gift them, and empower them to serve him. Because they would preach Jesus' message and do miracles by his power, these rugged fishermen were best or better suited for the task. The emphasis here is drawing attention to the power that they would have because of their association with Christ. And even, as we will emphasize starting now, the empowerment of the Spirit that Jesus says would come, and by which they could not have done what they had done otherwise. So he would draw them to himself. And many of them already knew one another. That was a good blessing, so they could have that blessing there. But here are the, let's see, what's the next point? Oh yeah, the calling. We're shifting to the calling in the chapter. We're shifting to the portion of the chapter that focuses on his calling. And we first meet Philip in John chapter 1. The day after Jesus had first called Andrew, John, and Peter, he says, you'll remember that Jesus had called those first three in the wilderness, and they were at the feet of John the Baptizer. John, all along, was saying, there's one coming after me. When he gets here, follow him. And when the Lord arrived, that's exactly what he said. Look, that's the one. That's the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world. Hear ye him. Follow him. And they did. Apparently, based on verse 43, John 1:43, Philip also was in the wilderness with John the Baptizer before returning to Galilee. And, well, before returning to Galilee, Jesus himself sought him out. Jesus sought him out. Incredible. He knew him. You don't seek someone out who you don't think's not going to do a good job. So this is the first time we see that Jesus himself actually sought someone and found them in this case, specifically called to the task. That language is unique. So that could be a good trivia question. Of all the apostles to this point, or disciples to this point, who was actually sought out by the Lord himself? Philip. And that is not to say that he wasn't sovereign in seeking all of them out, but we know that in the flesh, this is what he physically did. He just said, "Follow me." And he did. He did. He found Philip an eager and willing disciple. Again, if I were in quick mode, that's all I would need to know about Philip. Good guy. But chapter 6, or I should say, in the book, as we continue in the chapter, now we're at the portion of the feeding of the 5,000. This is where the author of the book spends most of his time editorializing his perception of his strengths as weaknesses. And they often are. Our next glimpses of Philip in chapter 6. We're going to look at this more closely now through Philip's eyes. So when the Messiah came to him and said, "Follow me," he embraced Jesus immediately and followed him without hesitation. This was his spiritual side. His heart was right. He was a man of faith. And it can be said of many of us, we're so often a person of weak faith. Lord, help me in my unbelief. Help develop and strengthen my faith. It's genuine, but I want it deeper. I want it stronger. I want it more full. And here his personality or unique makeup shows through, at least in the moment, in this little moment. Sometimes we look at the failures of people and think that defines them. Like Thomas, we think of him as doubting. What about Thomas, the one who believed the instant he saw truth? What about that Thomas? John describes how a great multitude had sought out Jesus and found him on a mountainside with his disciples. As we saw in chapter 1, to say this was a crowd of 5,000 doesn't do it justice. If you add those who could have been with the men by count, maybe even families, it could have been several more thousand, and likely was. This was a huge gathering of people. Matthew chapter 14, verse 15, the evening was approaching. Is anyone thinking about the consequences of this? Look at the time of day. Look at how many are coming. Well, we know someone was thinking about all this. The people needed to eat. Cause and effect. John chapter 6, verse 5. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" To be fair, that's the question. If you're in work literal mode, you're going to answer a question. If you're an analytical thinker, you're going to answer the question. It's a pro and a con, isn't it? Plus and a minus here. Why did he single out Philip? John said, this he said to test him. Now we have a lot of connotations to that word test. Some are good, some are bad, some are misapplied in the cases, but he said this was to test him, for he himself, I'm glad the scripture gives a disclaimer here, he himself, God, Jesus in flesh, Jesus, God in flesh, he knew what he would do. So Jesus knew what he was going to do. He knew how things were going to work out, but he, quote, tested him. Not tempt, test. Jesus, and I'm going to say it this way for careful consistency and also potency for time's sake. Jesus made sure to let this be a learning opportunity for Philip. Because I suspect with everything else Jesus knew Philip wasn't yet where he needed to be. It would have been great if he had given the spiritual answer, but he did not. Jesus wanted to make sure this was a faith-building opportunity. So Philip was apparently the apostolic administrator of the, quote, bean counter. That's where the subtitle is given. In other words, he was the one in charge of arranging the meals and the logistics. We know that Judas was in charge of keeping the money, but it makes sense that someone was also in charge of coordinating the acquisition and the distribution of the meals and the supplies. It was a task that certainly suited Philip's personality. Someone has to do it. And I'm sure that skill blessed the disciples every day. So Jesus was testing him. He wasn't testing him to find out what he was thinking. Jesus already knew that. He wasn't asking for a plan. Jesus already knew what he was going to do. So, of course, Jesus knew exactly what Philip was thinking. And he says, quote, I believe Philip had already begun counting heads. Very likely. When the crowd started moving in, he was already doing the estimates. And eating those days wasn't easy. So that by the time Jesus asked the question, he gives specifics in the answer. 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, and everyone have just a little. That's not even possible. It wouldn't be enough to even count. That's in verse 7. He had apparently been thinking through the difficulties of the food supply from the moment he saw the crowd. Instead of thinking, I'm with the Christ, and what a glorious occasion for Jesus to teach this crowd. The focus of his skill took his attention and encumbered all of his essence in this moment. And he looked at the situation as problematic and maybe even impossible. And I'll say, the author of our book seems to praise visionaries, and several like Peter are, and others. But people like Philip, can you imagine how difficult this was for him to get along with others within the group who were not exactly those who would think through things? People like Philip struggle in strife when paired up with visionaries who just don't think things through. But yes, in this moment's defense, you have to say none of us are with the physical Lord in flesh. But he was. He was with the physical Lord. And there were some miracles he saw. Some that he did see. Let's also be nice to all of our studies, to these men, because we study about what they went through. We forget that they hadn't went through it yet. This occasion miracle hasn't happened yet. And we would have been just like them. I believe that. Philip had been there when the Lord, created wine out of water, healed people with creative and regenerative miracles. But when he saw that crowd, that targeted his way of thinking, his skill sets, that made it hard for him to see past the material circumstances and embrace the spiritual. From a purely human perspective, maybe it was impossible. Maybe that's the point. In his defense, like I mentioned, he answered Jesus' question. Jesus' question, you remember, was specifically, let's see, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? If I'm in work literal mode and I'm not thinking of all the things I need to tell you, I'll give you the factual answer. But again, who's asking the question? The source of the bread of life himself. You missed it. You missed it. So the reality of the raw facts clouded his faith. In this moment, he wasn't there yet. He couldn't see the opportunity. Wouldn't it have been great if he had said, Lord, if you want to feed them, you can do it. I'm just going to stand back or get them all in a group or in a line and let you take care of it. No, that was not what he said. But I'm sure he later wished he had. And I have little doubt that he forgot this occasion and grew from it, just like the Lord's test was intended for him to. On the other hand, Andrew seemed to have a glimmer of the possibility, and the author does a pretty good job editorializing and deliberating the ideas of what Andrew must have been thinking to bring such a little amount to either validate it or to say that there's something he can do. But that's supposition. There's a lot of speculation there. But here's what we know. Philip needed to learn to set aside his pragmatic common sense concerns and learn to lay hold of the supernatural potential of faith. Indeed, because you're with the Messiah. The last occasion you notice from the beginning of the class, the little portion I read from that scan, is about this visit of the Greeks. We're going to conclude with this, and hopefully quickly. But we'll focus on it properly. John 12 gives us another insight into Philip's character. And this is an occasion where you see perhaps his timidity. He wasn't aggressive enough to do what may have been against protocol. And this is tough. It's a tough call. John chapter 12, verses 20 and 21. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So think about this. Greeks, God-fearing Greeks, want to see Jesus. Who do they go to for permission and thinking that they can make it happen? Philip, whose name only we know his Greek name. And his heritage seems to imply that he was Hellenistic by culture and training, at least the way he was living, other than his Jewish heritage. So these Greeks were very interested in Jesus. They sought Philip out, and it's very telling of the role that he probably had. He might have noticed that Jesus said on one occasion, "Oh, don't go the way of the Gentiles and do not enter the city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now, we know the context in Matthew 10 and the commission given there for a set time. You know, sometimes we take things out of context, but when you're in the moment, you probably don't. And yet, they did miss some things. But all these thoughts are going through their minds, even the one in Matthew 15:24 and Matthew 10:5-6. I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And statements like that were clearly in context of the order of normal priority of his ministry, to fulfill prophecy to the Jew first and then also to the Greek, which is now open to all. Romans 2:10. If only there could be protocol for every inconvenience and exception. That's probably what Philip was thinking. This doesn't fit what I know to do without breaking some rules. And that's, I hate to say that phrase, but in his mind it may have been thinking this, I don't know when, I don't know how, it's inconvenient time, so what do we do? Here's what he did. Philip had a good heart. So he directed him to Andrew, who he knew would take him to Jesus. It's interesting. It's sort of like, I don't want to get in trouble, so I'll let you get in trouble. I just jokingly say that. But anyway, he worked what he knew, and he did it that way. But what about taking him directly? I wasn't there, so I can't argue from anything other than what little I know. But we may safely assume that Jesus received those Greeks gladly, because he himself said, "The one who comes to me I will by no means cast out." John 6:37. In short, he preached the gospel to them and invited them to become his disciples. Was it the right thing to bring those Greeks to Jesus? Absolutely. Jesus himself welcomes all comers to drink freely of the water of life. Revelation 22:17. Our final glimpse, as I look at the watch that I'm hoping is fast, but it's probably set to the phone. Yep. Okay, good. We have 3.5 minutes about. Our final glimpse comes just a short time later in the upper room. The occasion is the Last Supper. And we know what's ahead for the Lord. Imagine what he must have been going through. Trying to wash his disciples' feet while they argue who's the best in the kingdom. Hey. Jesus would use in Luke 24:25, the words foolish, slow of heart to believe. Philip's statement here may have been the most heartbreaking. Here's the verse. Larry did a lot of work on this, and I don't want to, it's a shame to skip some of his work. It takes a lot of time for these slides. He says, do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? And of course, Philip's statement to him is, Lord, show us the Father. You've been with me for 3 years. You don't know me. You know, what emotions was Jesus suppressing? Or how did he say this in his tone? Lovingly, frustrating, angry, hurt, maybe all the above. Do you not believe that I'm the Father and Father's in me? You've seen me. You've seen the Father. So who knows in that moment? But that's a very discouraging statement. But again, a moment to teach the truth. Jesus was saying, I am to the Father what you are to me. I'm the one who speaks on the authority of the Father, as you will be speaking on the authority of me when the Spirit comes. Whew, it's incredible. And I love the definition of the word used in the Greek. Performs an act of legal significance for the benefit of the sender as opposed to him or herself. In this case, Jesus was an agent of God. And that is an accurate word. Jesus was here on a mission from the Father. Philip was already in the presence of the living God. And you would think that would be enough, but are we any different? We're on this side of the cross, and we still struggle to do and believe certain things that God commands us to do. So These people were just human, being perfected by the Lord. Point E, that night, Jesus' heart was heavy. He knew what lay ahead for him on the following day. He knew his time was with his disciples was at an end. And although they still seemed rather ill-prepared from a purely human standpoint, Jesus was going to send the Holy Spirit to empower them as witness. His earthly work with them was nearly finished. And he knew that persecutions would come. And that's why he promised to them the same thing that in a roundabout way, with the completion of the Word and the development that we have with the Spirit's guidance today, the same truth that divides all people was given to those who follow and to divide the people who don't. Let me reword this for clarity. Since the truth of Jesus divides all people into two categories, those who follow it, those who don't, he knows that the serious task is before them, and he would have to give them help. Acts 2, 1 through 4, he gave them help. On this screen, I hope you screenshot it and read every word later. Like the other disciples, Philip was a man of limited ability, immature in faith, imperfect in understanding, and had natural tendencies that were good in some areas, but struggled to accept the spiritual. And yet Jesus said, he's exactly what I'm looking for. He'll be instrumental in the establishment of my church. I'll make him a ruler in the kingdom. And I'll reward him in heaven. I'll write his name on one of the 12 foundation stones of the New Jerusalem. Thankfully, the Lord uses people like Philip. Lots and lots of people like Philip. So in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, as I mentioned earlier, Philip and all the disciples who were the apostles chosen for that purpose were given the power of the Spirit for that time. And it's that same Spirit who inspired the completion of the Word and who we are promised to be with as well. Philip was greatly used to spread the church throughout the early world and the early first century. And he, of course, passed away or was martyred in Hierapolis in Phrygia, Asia Minor. I hope you screenshot this and read all of it. Sadly, I don't have time for that. It's great research, great resource. But on this map, I'll draw attention to where Philip was martyred. Boom, right there. We studied Jesus' message to Laodicea, the church that was lukewarm because it didn't have the cool waters from Colossae or the warm waters from Hierapolis. There you go, Hierapolis. Here's the picture of the beautiful mineral springs. And the little dots where the line or arrow is drawing, those are people. So it shows the scape of all of this. Beautiful scenery. It looks like snow, but it's hard as rock. Hundreds of years it's been happening over there. Beautiful, beautiful area. And hot water has a benefit. Very nutritious or rich in mineral. Here is in the area in which Hierapolis, Philip was martyred, the picture of the gate that was found that according to Greek mythology was the gateway to hell. Yeah, or death, or Hades. And it just is interesting that the one preaching about heaven physically died there, and the Lord made sure he would be treated to the gates of heaven itself. Screenshot this for later. It's an amazing history of the place itself and how it was discovered. But it's just good to know that on this site there is, significant by even the coin that you see, a picture of the tomb in that area where it is believed Philip's body was buried. So, little interesting facts there. Larry Warren likes to add to this screen when they died. And I do want to conclude with a liberty of a minute, this screen. Philip obviously overcame the human tendencies that so often hampered his faith. He stands with the other apostles as proof that God has chosen the foolish things of this world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. A great verse selected for this purpose. God chose ordinary men for extraordinary purposes. And he does no different today in choosing us to accept the call of the gospel. Next up, Nathanael. and I believe that will be taught by Larry Warren. I've enjoyed the class. It's meant a lot to me. Hope you've enjoyed it as well. Get the book and enjoy your own personal study. Thank you all so much.